Easily the most eyebrow-raising and controversial part of the Golden Dome plan is the call to create and deploy space-based interceptors. It's technology that's been explored for decades, but critics have always said this simply isn't feasible. But is that still the case in 2025? We talk about that issue with our panel right now. So let's get to the big ticket item, the space-based interceptor. When this was announced, this was the thing that made a lot of people's eyebrows shoot up. So John, I'm going to give you a softball easy question. Can space-based interceptors work?
Softball, huh? So look, I think the answer to that is yes. And then it's really a yes but.
Okay.
Right? So yes, they can work. The issue of trying to hit something during the boost phase is pretty challenging. But fundamentally the question is, if you can successfully demonstrate this by 2028, what would it cost to put enough things in orbit for that to be useful? And you have to get Star Wars, the movie, out of your head. Spaceships, or in this case satellites with space-based interceptors, don't hover over a location, right? Because of the amount of time you are not going to have, you just have a few minutes here to hit one of these things, you're going to need to be in low Earth orbit. And if you're in low Earth orbit, you're traveling around the Earth at 17,000, kilometers per hour or something. And that means every 90 minutes to maybe 2 hours, you're whipping around the Earth. And every time you come around the Earth is spun, so now you're over a different place. So if you want coverage over one location, let's say you want coverage over the Korean Peninsula, right? North Korea, you know where there's a rough launch site, and you say, I'm going to cover this. How many satellites do you need to have so something is there? They're basically overhead for about 6 minutes. It just, the number goes up exponentially in order to cover that one location, to say nothing of the math of trying to hit something coming up while I'm screaming over the top. So I think the problem is not fundamental physics would allow me to do this with the right solution set. That's a hard challenge. But then fielding enough systems that it is actually a credible deterrent and not just something where I have to wait 3 minutes and then I can shoot.
So how does that actually work then, right? I mean, you can, like you said, your option one is you have a billion of these satellites that are just constantly in a ring, and so they'll catch everything.
It's not even that good, right?
Okay.
You need multiple rings because that ring will not constantly catch that. But go ahead.
So then what is a, let's call it a realistic, with the math and the physics, option that's out there?
So it's tough. I mean, I think, what I think about is General Whiting at Space Command talking about defeating the Chinese kill web. And what I think about is Admiral Paparo at Indo-PACOM talking about the need for counter C5ISRT, which you could put up on the bottom of the screen what all that is, in order to blind the adversary, right? And that really means we need space superiority, both to deter and to win in a missile fight. And for space superiority, that means taking action against adversary satellites. That's a different problem set. You know where the satellite is, you know when it's coming around, you can imagine effects you could use on those to help reduce the ability of China to know where maneuver forces are, or to be able to target them based on space-based sensor systems.
The biggest problem is the absentee ratio. At least in terms of the brilliant pebble kind of architectures, most of your space-based interceptors, especially if they're in a stable orbit of 300, 400 kilometers, or potentially higher, they're out of range, right? Their divert cone to be able to deorbit quickly and get that thing that's rising is very limited. And there's many, many, many interceptors that are not able to get there. And the fact that you can group your shots with a ground-based interceptor, like a next generation interceptor NGI or a GBI, that's one of the reasons we've kind of gone that way against the limited rogue threats that we've got. Having said that, in the reading list for the Space-Based Interceptor Industry Day, one of two readings on the topic was the CSIS Boost Phase Report from 2022. And the subtitle to that report was Interrogating the Assumptions. And the reason we put that there is that if we just try to do the same thing over and over, look at the old architectures and expect a different result, that's probably not going to be as fruitful. And one thing that I've heard General Whiting, for instance, say recently is, he in the Huntsville Space and Missile Defense Conference a couple weeks ago, he was kind of talking about this, talking about the static, brilliant pebble kind of architecture as not maneuver warfare. And so what I'm going to be looking for, and what I'm intrigued by, is the truly innovative and much more warfighting, much more active warfighting approaches to this in terms of space fires that is not necessarily coming from a stable orbit of 400, but think something in VLEO that if you had indications and warning that something might be coming, you don't need to stay up there for years. You might be able to tolerate a much lower orbit for this kind of stuff. And this is where the emergence of space fires, the advent of space fires, is going to create a ton of capability that is going to be slewed and come up with different ways to slew in from and through space at all kinds of threats, satellites, rising missiles, what have you. And so I believe we will get to boost phase capability and space-based intercept capability of different threats, but I believe it's going to emerge as a kind of subset of this space fires generally.
And I'll just, on space fires, just say, one of the things that a kinetic interceptor is constrained by is both, the momentum it already has because it's in orbit, and then the time it would take to get to a threat. Directed energy weapons often come up as a potential solution because, of course, in the time for that is really the speed of light. The problem with any of these things compared to being on the ground is once they're in space, you can't do maintenance on them, right? So you kind of have this fixed thing you put up, and it needs to work all the way until you need it, which is quite different than normal equipment, which normal equipment on the ground, and you're servicing, and you're changing, and you're updating it, and replacing old parts. So it creates a lot of challenges, a lot of challenges.
And this is exactly one of the reasons where I kind of intrigued by the idea of space planes in very low Earth orbit. Think about sorties as opposed to things that are up there and you can't fix or maintain or upgrade or that kind of stuff. So different ways to penetrate Chinese airspace from above and deliver space-launched effects of various imaginative kinds. I want the Chinese to be guessing, where'd that space plane go? Where did it maneuver? What's it got? Offensive payload, defensive payload? And I think that's the kind of radical challenging of the assumptions that can impose costs, that can create deception and confusion on the part of our adversaries, and actually, frankly, make this a little more achievable. They're trying to do the architecture of 1991.
And I think your point there about deception and confusion, really, if you think about it from classic deterrence, the whole point of any of these systems ought to be to stop the war in the first place. So you want to, sow doubt is a phrase that's kicked around. I'm not too enamored of it, but if the adversary believes that there's enough capability out there that they cannot overcome, or that this will be a disadvantage to them if they try to kick a fight off, then I think that is really a thing we're looking for.
Do you guys have a sense that industry understands fully what is possible and what's being asked of it? Or does this fall under, again, the question of Gutline's still actually building this architecture, and everyone right now is trying to posture themselves for what might come without actually having a good sense of what is required here?
So I would say that the Space-Based Interceptor Industry Day, which was held a couple weeks ago, put out their initial intent statement, but they also requested feedback from industry. And I think you're probably going to get a lot of feedback that says, hey, have you thought about this, and is this really the right approach to the acquisition strategy? So yes, the full architecture report due to the SecDef is not quite done yet, but nevertheless, there is an indication of where their mind is at. But I think the acquisition strategy will probably evolve based on the feedback and the adjustments and that kind of thing, and we'll see. But I don't think it's congealed by any means.
Yeah, I think there's clearly posturing going on. But look, the fact is there's a lot of money potentially at the table. And so if the problem set is money will be awarded to companies that can provide a space-based interceptor, and companies that think they can do that are absolutely going to go and work on that. And some of them are going to do, and I'm sure many of them are working on kind of lead. They're doing stuff ahead of an RFP because they think, okay, I need to get a head start so I understand what my specs are and what I need to do to be able to get after this.
Final call. In 3 years, do we have a test of an SBI successfully completed?
My gut says yes. My gut says some version of that test will go off in 28, and I think it'll be interesting to know if it's kind of a fly-off with multiple opportunities, or if the time constraints and the constraints for hardware and launch are such that you just really end up with one. I think I'd prefer to see a couple and see how it goes.
Yeah, I think the same. I think they're looking at a couple different gates or tests that can, at this point in the acquisition plan, be demonstrated, different pieces of the problem to be demonstrated, and provided they put some things on contract here soon, and we're not there yet, I'm optimistic that they will certainly have the tests. We'll see whether they get to the particular point in space that they need to be at the particular millisecond they need to be there. But I'm hopeful about that as well.